7-part long-distance walk series. Just behind me is Manningtree Station, and it marks the very start of the St Edmund Way, an 80-mile long-distance trail passing through the Essex, Suffolk and Norfolk countryside to end at Brandon. Let's take a look at today's part. Starting off at the train station at Manningtree, the route heads immediately away from the coast and to the riverbank footpath along RSPB Catawade Marshes. This leads me to the spectacular Flatford Mill, which is owned and managed by the National Trust. Continuing west, the route crosses through the rest of the beautiful Dedham Vale area of outstanding natural beauty, passing a small village of Stratford St Mary, and takes a meandering route through the gentle hills around Stoke by Nayland. Passing the village church and continuing further along, my first day ends at the village of Nayland, right on the Suffolk-Essex border, where I rejoin the River Stour and follow it to my overnight stop. It feels really good to get the walking boots on again and head out on another long-distance trail. Much of today's walk follows the Stour Valley Path, a 62-mile long-distance route that I completed earlier this summer, but the very start is all new as I pass along the south side of Catawade Marshes. The extensive reedbed is home to some rare wildlife, including many waders and birds of prey. Just up ahead is the spectacular 18th century Grade 1 listed Flatford Mill. The mill was built in 1733 and is now in the great care of the National Trust and made famous by the legendary painter John Constable. A short detour will take you over the bridge and down the lane to see this spectacular building from its most attractive perspective. Just behind is Willie Lott's cottage, another building featured in John Constable's paintings and also Grade 1 listed. The River Stour is keeping me company for the next few miles as I cross into open grazing pastures, past the village of Dedham and into the village of Stratford St Mary. The roar of the A12 bypass is an unwelcome disturbance to the tranquillity, but the noise quickly fades as I head out of the village and continue along the River Stour. As you make your way through Dedham Vale, take care as you pass the larger livestock, as these low-lying fields are the perfect place to graze cattle. The small village of Stratford St Mary is passed before the River Stour is crossed near Stratford Lock. It is here that the route enters into Essex briefly, as the river marks the boundaries of the two counties. The River Stour is good company for a short while, with plenty of wildlife to see, including kingfishers, mallards and other birds. As you make your way further along, the route passes a large lake, and for those with binoculars you might be able to make out some waders feeding in the mudflats. As I cross the River Stour, this is the last time I'll see its gentle flowing waters for quite a few miles, until I reach Nayland at the end of the day in fact. but it's time to experience some of the gentle rolling hills and beautiful countryside this area is known for. A gentle ascent north along Snow Hill Lane allows for more distant views over the surrounding countryside and is a welcome change from the lower walking earlier on. The hills might only be about 150 foot high, but the scenery is simply beautiful and they allow for some of the best views along the whole route. Up ahead is Scotland Place, a stunning 16th century timber-framed house and one of many ancient buildings in the area. And it's only slightly further along that you are treated to a superb view over the River Box to the countryside around the village of Polstead. I'm now entering the stunning village of Stoke by Nayland. Nestled 180 feet on the top of a hill, its towering church of St Mary is a real landmark within the Dedham Vale area of outstanding natural beauty. The church itself was built in the late 13th or early 14th century, and only slightly older than some of the other buildings in the village. Just a few miles further along is the village of Nayland, and this is my final destination for today and the perfect place to end a diverse and interesting start to the trail. The second day's walking along the St Edmund Way begins at the village of Nayland and follows the River Stour west past Wiston Mill and Hall. The route heads north through woodlands and open countryside to Wissington Grange, before turning west again past Spouse's Vale to descend down into the village of Beghaus for the perfect halfway stop-off. Heading north out of Beghaus, the path follows the edge of the Stour Valley, over the railway line, and through the villages of Lamarsh, Great Henny and Middleton. The route continues north, arriving into Sudbury via the old railway line, and another encounter with the River Stour. Nayland is a beautiful historic village with its early 15th century church and dozens of stunning timber-framed houses. Just on the village's south side is Court Knoll, a large scheduled ancient monument worthy of a little detour, as it's probably the oldest part of the village. This large D-shaped enclosure has had some significant recent archaeological investigations, which revealed the remains of a chapel at the northeastern corner and a possible manor house on the low-lying ground, all surrounded by a rampart and ditch. the St Edmund Way briefly follows a beautiful section of the River Stour, with the tumbling waters of the weir and the meandering waterways leading you round to a conservation pond. After crossing the busy A134, the path follows field edges past Wiston Mill and up towards Wiston Hall, its medieval moat and Church of St Mary. The moat itself currently surrounds the late 18th century Wiston Hall, but likely once protected a much older hall on the same site. Nearby is the beautiful Norman Church of St Mary, dating to the late 12th century, and stands isolated on a small island within a floodplain. As you head north through Wissington, the route passes through a large area of woodland, carefully managed to attract and support the local wildlife. As you begin heading west for the final stretch into Beghaus, a track is followed on the very edge of Spouse's Vale and the famous Eiger Nature Reserve. Owned and managed by Suffolk Wildlife Trust, the woodland plays host to many rare birds, insects and plant species, and is famous for its bluebell display in spring. As you cross several open fields and join a track near Beghaus, just to the south there is the restored chapel of St Stephen. This chapel dates from the early 12th century and is said to have been built on the site of the King Church, where Edmund was crowned King of the Angles in 855 AD, and a fitting connection to this long-distance trail. Only a few minutes walk up ahead is the village of Beghaus. There are a couple of basic amenities, including the 8 Bells pub, which makes the perfect stop for some lunch before continuing to Sudbury. The Stour Valley Path, another long-distance trail, is followed to Sudbury. It hugs the edge of the Stour Valley as it makes its way north, and it's along here that you'll probably notice many pillboxes and other wall remains. This pillbox sits right on the edge of the St Edmund's Way and overlooks the meandering river. It's one of many along the stretch between Beghaus and Lavenham. The first village you arrive at is Lamarsh, with its community-owned Lamarsh Lion pub. On the edge of the village is the beautiful spired early 12th century parish church, which is visited before heading up and over the gentle hills to Great Henny. The views offered by gaining a little height are extensive, although you can't see it. In the distance over there is Long Melford Church, 6.5 miles away, and you can see how the town of Sudbury sits down in a shallow bowl surrounded by farmland. The spired church of Great Henny is past, which is believed to date from the 11th or 12th century, and is registered as a small place of pilgrimage. Passing Great Henny, the route follows the edge of the Grand Rise Hall estate, with its beautiful 17th century timber-framed house, and continues north over gentle hills past the final village of Middleton. My final destination of Sudbury is edging ever closer. It's been a long day's walking, but there are a few more highlights that still need exploring before I rest up for the night. The first of these is the path along the old railway line linking Sudbury to the surrounding villages. It crosses the Stour several times, each with its own unique view over the glistening waters and meadows. I turn off the railway line past the Quay Theatre to arrive at Sudbury town centre and the end of this excellent day's walking. Day 3 of the St Edmund Way begins in the Suffolk town of Sudbury and follows 12 miles of riverside and railway footpaths. After following narrow streets, the route heads out onto the meadows by the croft and joins the railway near Brundon Mill. The route then follows almost a mile of the Sudbury to Melford railway line to arrive at Liston Mill and the meadow path leading to Long Melford. Heading north out of the village past Melford Hall and through Kentwell Hall Estate, the route then crosses several large open fields to rejoin the old railway line. This is then followed for over 2 miles before heading through the churchyard and into the village centre of Lavenham with its many choices of evening meal and overnight stay. Sudbury is the third largest town along the St Edmund Way, with its bustling high street and frequent market days. With local shops, pubs, restaurants and cafes, it's the perfect place to break up the walk, with many places offering a hearty breakfast before an adventurous day ahead. Leaving the town, the route heads down to the croft and along part of the River Stour next to open grazing marsh, and the whole area is designated a nature reserve. Passing a Type 27 World War II pillbox, the path continues to Brundon Mill. The mill sits next to the River Stour and possibly dates as far back as the 15th century, but now converted into housing. Just beyond Brundon Mill, the old Sudbury to Melford railway line is joined and followed for some distance. Known locally as the Valley Walk, it forms part of the Gainsborough Trail, creating a superb circular walk around the town. After a mile or so along the railway line, you will arrive at Rodbridge, with Melford Country Park on the opposite side of the river. With numerous trails through woodland, fields and around small lakes, this country park plays host to plenty of wildlife and worthy of a short detour if time allows. Long Melford is almost reached as you pass close to the 12th century Liston Church and continue along field edges to Liston Mill and another short section of riverbank walking. narrow alley leads you to the heart of the village of Long Melford and the halfway point on today's walk. Long Melford is a beautiful historic village with a wide street and dozens of shops, pubs and restaurants to eat at. Most of the buildings along the high street are many centuries old and listed in order to protect them, but the most famous is probably the Bull Hotel, which dates to the 15th century. Continuing north out of the village and up to the green, the St Edmund Way passes the spectacular 16th century Melford Hall, which is owned and managed by the National Trust. The grounds of the hall might not be as extensive as other National Trust properties, but this is one of the many locations that the legendary children's author Beatrix Potter regularly came on holiday to visit her cousins. As you reach the green, there are more historic interests to be seen, including the Trinity Hospital dating to 1573 and the spectacular 14th century Holy Trinity Church, which has to be one of the grandest parish churches in East Anglia. Behind the grand church is the beautiful Kentwell Park estate, with its half-mile long avenue of trees leading to a grand stately home. The 16th century Kentwell Hall sits within a large moat and is of similar architecture to nearby Melford Hall. After crossing the busy A134, the trail heads out into more open countryside once again. It's simple and easy walking with hidden historic remains like this Type 22 pillbox from World War II. Just beyond the pillbox, the trail follows the longest section of railway walking along the entire route at just over 2 miles. Although intermittent at times, and to begin with, hard to make out, as you progress further towards Lavenham, the remains of the Industrial Revolution become more obvious and very enjoyable to follow. Along this railway there are many more World War II remains, including this well-preserved Type 27 pillbox, just a stone's throw from the trackbed. As you enter the historic village of Lavenham, the route passes under the spectacular church of St Peter and St Paul before passing many of the local amenities to head up to the village square. Along this path is Beghaus, used as a basis for Godric's Hollow in the Harry Potter films. The ancient Guildhall overlooks the market square. Built in 1520, the 2-storey timber-framed building is now in the care of the National Trust and houses a museum detailing its rich history. With the village pubs, shops, restaurants and overnight accommodation, it's the perfect place to break up this section before the longer day ahead to Bury St Edmunds. Day 4 of the St Edmund Way starts off in the historic village of Lavenham and follows field edges past the first of many ancient moats along today's route. The path passes through the site of Lavenham Airfield before crossing the A134 at Alpheaton near Hunt's Moat. The route heads north from here, bypassing Shimpling Park and another ancient moat just south of Stanningfield. Crossing through the Rookwood Hall estate, the St Edmund Way soon joins the old railway line at Greatwell Neatham and crosses the A134 once more by Rushbrook Arms. Passing the small village of Nowton, the route crosses Hardwick Heath, past West Suffolk Hospital and descends down into the historic town of Bury St Edmunds. Lavenham is a beautiful and historic village, and it seems a shame to be heading away from its stunning timber-framed houses, but ahead promises plenty of history on today's walk, with the beautiful town of Bury St Edmunds at the end. As you cross the fields away from the village, just to the east are the remains of a mill that once stood to 6 stories and was built in 1831. Just in the middle of the field to the west is also a Type 27 pillbox from World War II, with clear evidence of the anti-aircraft gun placement on its roof. The first of several moats is quickly reached as you progress away from the village. Within this plantation, and easily seen from the path, is a moat that once surrounded Lavenham Park Lodge. The hunting lodge once sat on the edge of an extensive deer park which was owned by the Earls of Oxford and dates to the medieval period. On the northern end of the deer park are a couple of isolated buildings, likely remains of the World War II Lavenham Airfield which was built in 1943. Evidence suggests that a few buildings still remain on the site, with these two sitting close to the St Edmund Way and looking roughly of the right age. The village of Alpheaton is skirted, and with no pubs or shops, there's no need for a detour. But just up ahead is Hunt's Moat. This moat is a small square and appears isolated from the main village, with traces of building foundations found within its defences. It's from this point that the route turns north and begins the long trek to Bury St Edmunds. As you pass Shimpling Park, a short detour will take you to the third moat of today. This one also dates to the medieval period, sits isolated and remains unoccupied. Just over a mile further ahead is the fourth and last moat seen on today's walk. The Ordnance Survey lists this as Great Saxes Farm, with historical records suggesting the moat dates to the medieval period, with medieval and post-medieval finds discovered nearby. This beautiful church is the parish church of Stanningfield and dates as far back as the Norman period, and by far one of the oldest structures seen so far on today's walk. It sits on the edge of the Rookwood Hall estate, which leads me north across vast open fields towards the railway line at Greatwell Neatham. This is the same railway line that I followed on the previous day's walk, which links Sudbury to Long Melford and Lavenham and finally on to Bury St Edmunds. The line was opened in 1865 and carried passengers for almost 100 years before closing in 1961. Heading off the railway line, the St Edmund Way passes the beautiful Rushbrook Arms, offering the perfect stop for some food or drinks before continuing the remaining 4.5 miles to Bury St Edmunds. The Norman church of St Peter is passed on the way to Bury St Edmunds, and just a short way beyond is an Ordnance Survey triangulation pillar. Marking a height of 84 metres above sea level, it's from here on that the route descends down into Hardwick Heath and to the town centre. As you progress down into Bury St Edmunds, the path passes St James's Gate, a Norman tower dating to 1121 and used as a bell tower for the nearby cathedral. I've decided to end the day's walk at Angel Hill, outside the spectacular Abbey Gardens and Gatehouse, which I will go on to explore before heading out tomorrow. Bury St Edmunds is the glorious town at the start of today's section of the St Edmund Way. After exploring the enigmatic ruins at the cathedral and Abbey Gardens, I'm heading north out of the town, past the ruins of St Saviour's Hospital and through a housing estate to join the riverbank footpath close to Fornham St Martin. The route continues along the River Lark to the northwest, with views over to the ruined tower of the Church of St Genevieve, and eventually arrives at the small village of Culford. Shortly ahead, I'm going to take a tiny detour to visit the spectacular West Stow Hall before getting back on track and walking along the edge of the Suffolk Wildlife Trust Lackford Lakes Nature Reserve. The reserve is home to thousands of birds and insects and sits next to West Stow Country Park with its reconstructed Anglo-Saxon village. Just beyond is the village of Lackford, which has public transport links to nearby Mildenhall and Bury St Edmunds for an overnight stop. Bury St Edmunds is a spectacular historic town, a jewel in the crown of Suffolk, and all built up around the ancient abbey and cathedral. For all those visiting the town, Abbey Gardens is a must, with dramatic ruins set amongst peaceful gardens. The earliest monastery here was Saxon in origin and dating to 633 AD. In 903 AD, the body of King Edmund was brought here, and the first abbey church was built soon after to honour this saintly king. Soon after the Norman conquest, the monastery was replanned on a much grander scale, the remains of which are visible today thanks to expert conservation from English heritage. After heading up Abbeygate Street, the St Edmund Way passes another ruin. This one is of St Saviour's Hospital and dates to the 12th century. The hospital was built by the Abbey of St Edmund, and for over 350 years it looked after elderly monks before the dissolution of the monasteries in 1539. I finally joined the River Lark, which will keep me company for much of today's walk, and also follows the Lark Valley path. The St Edmund Way crosses the Suffolk Golf and Country Club and continues along the River Lark almost as far as Hengrave. As you make your way along the river, just to the north is the ruined church of St Genevieve. All that remains is the 15th century tower, but the history of the site likely dates back much further, possibly to the Norman period. The road is briefly joined near Hengrave, which leads me onto the village of Culford and to the grand entrance to Culford School Estate. As you enter the grounds, the Church of St Mary is passed before heading around the exquisite Culford Hall. The hall itself was built in 1790 on the site of a much older house, all set within 500 acres of parkland. As I make my way along the lakeshore, up ahead is a rather unique bridge. The iron bridge at Culford School was built in 1803 and is the oldest tubular cast iron bridge in the world, and it is of such historical significance that it has been given a Grade 1 listing. As I enter the village of Weststow, I've decided to take a short detour to Weststow Hall. The impressive brick gatehouse, polygonal turrets and mansion date to the early 16th century, but sadly the roadside is as close as you can get to this spectacular building. Just after Weststow village, the route follows a beautiful section of the River Lark, with the expansive open water to the south. The lake forms part of a larger network of waterways and pools, making up the Suffolk Wildlife Trust Blackford Lakes Nature Reserve. The former gravel pits make up a 118-hectare site of special scientific interest, and a worthwhile day out for those wanting to see some of the breathtaking wildlife living in the Brecks from one of its many hides. St Edmund Way passes along the south side of King's Forest to arrive at Westow Country Park and its Saxon heritage and reconstructed village. The village was reconstructed after many years of excavation and depicts life in the area between 420 and 650 AD and is a must for all aspiring archaeologists. Just beyond the Saxon village, the St Edmund Way joins the Icknield Way, and it's here that I've decided to head into the village of Lackford and use public transport onto Bury St Edmunds and return the following morning to continue to Thetford. The route to Thetford starts close to the village of Lackford, next to Westow Country Park, and follows a long section of the Icknield Way, an ancient track running through Suffolk. The Icknield Way crosses through King's Forest along an avenue of trees for several miles to reach a crossing of the B1106 south of Elvedon. The route briefly leaves the original Icknield Way, only to rejoin it again near Old Barnham Slip, where it continues northeast in the direction of Thetford. On the outskirts of the town, the St Edmund Way crosses Barnham Cross Common, which sits alongside the British Trust of Ornithology Nunnery Lakes Nature Reserve. Once in the town, there's a short detour to visit the spectacular Mott and Bailey earthworks, before joining the Little Ouse River and ending in the town centre. After getting public transport back to Lackford, the St Edmund Way almost immediately joins the Icknield Way. The path passes through the King's Forest, with the autumn colours really beginning to shine today. The King's Forest, along with Thetford Forest, collectively form the largest lowland forest in the UK. The Icknield Way is an ancient trackway, possibly dating back to prehistoric times, and most certainly used in the Roman period through to the medieval times. It joins the famous Ridgeway in Wiltshire and follows a chalk escarpment all the way to Norfolk, where it joins the Peddersway National Trail. A long-distance path known as the Icknield Way Trail is a 110-mile route that follows the line of the ancient trackway. Walking through miles of forest is a real change from the arable fields and low-lying marsh earlier on the St Edmund Way. I'm now deep into the Brecks, a 393 square mile area of dry, sandy heath and woodland. Its unique habitat is home to some of the rarest wildlife in the country, including stone curlew, woodlark and firecrests. The St Edmund Way continues northeast for some miles before any interruptions, the first being a crossing of the B1106 at Shelter House Corner, just on the south side of Elvedon Park. It's here that the route leaves the Icknield Way briefly, before rejoining it at Barrow's Corner. It's here that the route leaves the Icknield Way briefly before rejoining at Barrow's Corner, where 3 long-distance trails, the Icknield Way, St Edmund Way and Angles Way, all combine together, destined for the nearby town of Thetford. The route is briefly interrupted by another road crossing, with the distant roar of the A11 just a mile or so to the northwest, but it doesn't distract from the beauty of this unique and interesting Breckland landscape. The St Edmund Way gently descends down to Barnham Cross Common, a 171-acre site of special scientific interest on the southern outskirts of Thetford. It's a local nature reserve and forms part of the Breckland Special Area of Conservation. On the common's eastern side is Nunnery Lakes, a beautiful nature reserve owned and managed by the British Trust for Ornithology. Formed from old gravel pits, the reserve is now home to rare wildlife, with 3 kilometres of trails allowing people to explore this rare habitat. As I enter the town of Thetford, it's hard to miss its rich history. This is Nunnery Arch, built in 1600 and was once the entrance to the nearby St George's Nunnery. As I make my way further into the town, I cross over Nuns Bridges, which marks where the ancient Icknield Way crossed the River Thet and Little Ouse in 3000 BC. A short but very worthwhile detour off the St Edmund Way leads me to Castle Park. Here, large earthworks of ramparts and ditches, dating as far back as the Iron Age, defend the second highest Norman motte in the country. Thetford Castle once stood atop of this large motte, which dates back to the early Norman period, and one of 2 castles in the town. The Little Ouse is followed into the town centre and to my overnight stop, with just 1 day's walking left before I reach the end of the St Edmund Way. The 7th and final day along the St Edmund Way begins at the historic town of Thetford and follows the Little Ouse River west past the Priory ruins, under the A11 and into Thetford's vast woodland around Abbey Heath. Continuing north, the route passes a large power station and turns west again past the site of St Helen's Church. Just beyond is Santon Church and medieval moat, which are passed before arriving at the tiny village of Santon Downham. The St Edmund Way heads out of the village through more woodland to join a track that leads straight to the High Street of Brandon and the end of this long distance trail. Welcome to the very final day of the St Edmund Way. I'm here in the historic town of Thetford with an interesting 9-mile route ahead which takes me all the way to Brandon. The path begins along the Little Ouse with views over to the ruins of Thetford Priory on the other side of the river. The Priory of Our Lady of Thetford was one of the largest and most important monasteries in medieval East Anglia. Founded in the early 12th century, there are extensive ruins open to the public which include the lower walls of the church and cloister, a very impressive selection of rooms making up the prior's lodgings, and an almost complete 14th century gatehouse. Getting back on track, the path heads under another bridge to keep to the riverbank footpath and continues under the A11 bypass further ahead. Just beyond the A11 is a small private fishing lake called Kingfisher Lake. As the name would suggest, kingfishers are often seen here, along with other wildlife that seem to ignore the rumbling traffic nearby. After a couple of miles of peaceful woodland and riverbank walking, there is a sudden shock to the system. This large structure is a power plant which seems to be a rather odd place for one. The St Edmund Way sticks to the riverbank path past the building, with its rumbling noises quickly fading away as the path progresses west. A short section of road walking is another shock, but this one lasts only a few minutes before the path heads back into the woodland and away from the busy traffic. As you leave the woodland just before Santon Downham Country Park, there's the site of St Helen's Church. A nearby information board shows what this early 12th century church would have looked like thanks to excavations in 1961 and 62. They found that parts of the church were built from reused Roman tile and mortar, with possible older phases of the church dating to the 11th century. Standing high up on the hill overlooking the Little Ouse River, and with the natural spring of St Helen's Well nearby, you can clearly see why this site was chosen to build a church. As you enter Santon Downham Country Park, the St Edmund Way passes the tiny All Saints Church. All Saints was rebuilt in 1628 on the site of an earlier medieval church, with later remodelling in 1858. Just a few minutes' walk from here is the medieval moated site of Santon Hall or Lodge. Believed to date to the 13th century, the earthworks remain in remarkable condition thanks to the lack of later building work and farming. Just to the west are also the earthworks of the medieval village of Santon. As you enter the village of Santon Downham, you can't miss the 13th century church which overlooks the green. The church has some Norman elements suggesting that it's been remodelled over the centuries and serves a tiny population of less than 240 inhabitants. Leaving the village marks the final part of the St Edmund Way to the town of Brandon. A simple walk through another part of Thetford Forest leads past horse paddocks to Gashouse Drove. Drove is a linear track taking you straight to the High Street in Brandon town centre. The St Edmund Way ends here because Brandon has a significant Saxon heritage which has continued through the medieval period to the present day and lies deep within the Saxon kingdom of the East Angles.